All right. And we're live on Energy Superheroes. Today we have Tom Kirkman. And Tom has been in international oil and gas for 20 years, and he has dealt with oil companies in more than 30 countries. By day job, does project management in the energy industry. He's got a lot of offshore oil and gas experience, which is not something we've had before on the show. And Tom believes that over the next 20 years, fossil fuels will grow, not shrink, and that the laws of physics do not support an energy transition. Tom, welcome to the podcast and tell us why you think the laws of physics do not support an energy transition.
Hi, Peter. It's nice to be on your show. It's very simple. I've been reading and writing comics about oil and gas for a long time, a decade. And other people have come up with scientific formulas. I'm not a mathematician, but basically demonstrating how you can't build enough realistically solar and wind power to take over hydrocarbons plus nuclear. So I'm not a huge proponent of nuclear, but we need it. It provides reliable, consistent energy, but it's very simple. The laws of physics state the sun's not shining. You are not going to get energy out of a solar power panel. When it's not blowing, you're not going to get energy out of a wind turbine unless you're actually powering the wind turbine with diesel when the wind's not blowing. And that's actually happened by this out. So electricity is basically a fleeting energy. It is not a primary energy unless you're talking about lightning. I consider lightning to be a primary source of energy, but it's fleeting. It dissipates. Oil, natural gas, coal can all be stored fairly easily. Electricity, not so much, even if you use batteries, because the battery leaves power and it gets the colder the weather, the faster the energy loss is. So my general way of looking at this is wind and solar and hydro can augment or add to hydrocarbons, or as you call them, fossil fuels. And the United States can't build 100,000 more dams. So clearly hydro is pretty much static the way it is right now, unless there's droughts in which hydro will be reduced. But there's not much way to realistically increase hydro in the United States or Europe. Wind and solar, as Germany has proven over the last 10 years with their policies to implement huge amounts of wind and solar, they have spent massive amounts of money and it hasn't worked. They're still dependent, even more so, fossil fuels. They're going back to coal. So with the natural gas being shut off from Russia, Germany stopped buying coal in August of last year because that's when the sanctions against Russian coal came in. What happened is they increased their coal from the United States. So they just switched their sources, but they increased 8% more coal than they did the year before. So coal usage is going up, not down. In the history of the world, there's only been a couple times in history where any energy source has significantly reduced. So one was during the COVID pandemic when everything got locked down. The only other thing that I can really think of is whale oil is no longer used for an illumination source. It wasn't really an energy source, it was an illumination source. And it was preferable to other sources because it was more clean burning. But wood continues to be used. Coal continues to be used. Oil and gas continue to be used. Nuclear continues to be used, except what's being shut down. And increasing amounts of wind and solar are being added. And the world just continues to need more and more varied sources of energy. But intermittent energy is unlikely to replace reliable, storable energy. So I'll stop talking for a minute and let you catch up.
No, that's great. And so I'll say I am a believer in an energy transition. However, I'm also a believer in the uniquely amazing attributes of fossil fuels. And one of those attributes is the natural ability to be stored. And a lot of people don't know this, but fossil fuels are the result of millions and millions of years of compacted organisms that had CO2, which is why they become hydrocarbon, but also why when you combust them, why you're emitting CO2. So it's an interesting natural process that created fossil fuels, and it's actually quite miraculous. One thing that's also interesting and important to remember is the degree to which our modern lifestyle is powered by fossil fuels. And when it comes to feeding ourselves, clothing ourselves, having shelter, all those things are directly attributable to fossil fuels. So we're nurtured in a modern, convenient lifestyle. And as a result, we've been able to gain great mastery, I think, over the climate as a result of fossil fuels. So the question is, if we were to replace them, how could we? And is it even possible in our lifetimes?
No, electricity is not the same as hydrocarbons. Again, electricity is fleeting. It is storable to a small degree. You can store oil in barrels or caves. You can store natural gas in salt mines. You can store the stuff for a very long time and use it whenever you need it. Electricity, not so much. Now, batteries, I've been hearing for a long time, oh, the technology for batteries will improve and that's what's going to save the planet. No, this is just thinking. So until the science can actually support it, electricity can't manufacture plastics, can't make medicines, can't come up with a gazillion, that's an exaggeration, obviously, the multitude of products that modern civilization depends on, all sorts of plastics, your phone, your computer, so many things and shampoos and all this other stuff come from hydrocarbons, primarily oil. Taking oil out of the equation leaves a big gaping hole in civilization as we know it. Modern civilization is powered by fossil fuels, primarily oil for materials and natural gas for energy. Coal also for energy, but coal is the workhorse of energy. It has been for a long time. And I know a lot of places, the new coal burning power plants in the West, especially in the United States, are far more cleaner burning than they used to be. But I'm a strong proponent of natural gas. I view natural gas as a renewable resource. Nature makes it. It's methane. Methane is naturally occurring. You know this when you eat beans. Seriously, you go to a landfill, you will have methane all over the place. So nature creates methane. I tend to view oil through the prism of thinking of it as liquid sunshine because oil was made. You can't make oil, from my understanding, without energy from the sun. All these organisms and plants and however oil is made, and there's debates whether it's biological or non-biological, so not finite resource. I tend to believe oil is not exactly what it's labeled as a finite resource, but it's stored compressed energy and you can use it whenever you want. So oil was a huge game changer for planet Earth. It allowed modern civilization to flourish and prosper. It allows 8 billion people to exist on the planet. If you take oil out of the equation, that's no longer possible because electricity won't come to provide power through the outlet in your wall, power EVs. You are not going to get sufficient energy to do heavy industry, which is what Germany has found out, which is why a lot of factories in Germany are closing down and some of them are considering moving to the US. And also the longer term outlook for hydrocarbons, oil. And when I say hydrocarbons, normally I'm referring mostly to oil and gas. Don't get that involved in coal, but has openly stated starting 2 years ago, and they brought it up again recently, considering moving to the United States, moving your entire corporate headquarters in the Netherlands to the United States because the tax structure and ESG regulations that are expanding in the EU are becoming so difficult for international oil companies to work with that they would make more profits for their investors. They move to the United States. I don't want to get political on this. Know that the current administration and the previous administration in the US had different views on policies. And I just find it mind boggling that Shell, which is a super major oil company, is considering at this point in time, moving to the United States to get tax reduction on their product, which is oil. Back over to you.
I know, very interesting. So when I think of fossil fuels, they do represent about 80% of the energy. And of course, I like to differentiate between energy and power. When I think of power, I think of generating electricity or generating some sort of industrial process. And when I think of energy, I think of everything, which includes transport fuels and everything that we use in terms of energy. What makes fossil fuels so incredible is that they are abundant, they're controllable, and they're transportable, right? So that mix of attributes is really hard to get from other places. And I think that's why we focus on the electricity grid first in terms of trying to decarbonize. And even with that, it's very much a challenge. As you mentioned, wind and solar rely on controllable, transportable, abundant forms of energy to support them because they are intermittent. And as a result, you need some significant advancements in long duration battery storage if that's the way you're going to go. Now, you mentioned renewable natural gas. I'm a huge fan of that. And there's been tremendous amount of investment coming into that sector where you can take renewable natural gas from a landfill or from a dairy farm. And what's nice about it, it is also abundant, controllable, and transportable the way that regular natural gas is. Now, the word abundant, I think we can take with a grain of salt because today there isn't that much of it, but it's expanding very rapidly. I'm also a huge fan of hydrogen. I know there's some challenges with how you make hydrogen, um, but it is in fact abundant, transportable, and controllable, which is what we need. So to me, I look at fossil fuels and I think the big mistake a lot of people make is to belittle fossil fuels and not recognize the value that they've brought to our modern society. You just can't get around that. So if you're going to try to replace them or have some sort of energy transition, it has to be controllable, transportable, and abundant. If it's not those three things, then it's not going to work. So clearly, wind and solar are not that, and neither are batteries today. And I think everybody has to acknowledge that. So I like to get to a place of sort of common agreement, which is we do need a source of energy that's abundant, controllable, and transportable if we even hope to have an energy transition. So that's my position on it. And I do think that rising CO2 levels, while significantly overstated, let's say in the mainstream narrative in terms of the damage that they'll cause in the near term, are a long-term problem for us. So we may not be able to get to that science. Climate science, I know, is a huge thing to unpack, but I do approach it from the viewpoint of that in the long run, we're going to be better off without emitting significant amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. So as a result, I think it makes a lot of sense to look for ways to find alternatives that are in fact controllable, transportable, and abundant. And then we could possibly have an energy transition as long as it meets those attributes. So we're not there today, but at least if we look for substances, alternatives that meet those qualifications, we can have a shot at it. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, let me throw out quite a number of thoughts at the moment. One, I just noticed you have a picture of Nicholas Tesla on your back wall.
I do.
I just noticed that now. Two, I grew up on a dairy farm, and I can assure you there's lots of renewable natural gas. I don't see currently a viable alternative to hydrocarbons. If anyone can come up with the three attributes you've listed, that is a suitable, viable replacement for oil and gas, great. Until then, it's just talk. So I stick by my basic premise of other forms of energy can hydrocarbons, and currently we are not in a physics or science position to replace hydrocarbons. That happens what's going to happen is economies will be destroyed. People will be thrown out of work. There will be rolling power blackouts. Look what's going on in South Africa right now. They're having rolling power blackouts and electricity shortages. In the United States and much of the EU, electrical power grids are all loaded. And with governments pushing to add in EVs, this is going to make the problem worse. So electric utility companies in the US, I know because I spent some time as a consultant for project management with an electrical utility company in the West. And they're going great guns trying to upgrade the electrical infrastructure in the United States, the trailway, basically making them double or triple the amount of electricity capacity than they used to have. But it's fairly slow going. It's not going to happen overnight. So any kind of transition toward electricity cannot happen realistically unless and until the electrical grid infrastructure is greatly increased. Now, Elon Musk came out, I think 2 years ago, 2 years, and said for the electrical grid infrastructure to handle what he foresees in the near term foreseeable future for electric vehicles, the electrical grid in the United States needs to be doubled. That's a huge amount of expense. That's a huge amount of man hours. It's a huge amount, just huge amounts of money. It's just not going to happen anytime soon. So for the foreseeable future, I'm still looking at the world is going to continue to need increasing amounts of fossil fuels. That includes coal, oil, and gas, and currently LNG. That's the latest thing going on right now. The US and Australia and a number of other countries are shipping huge amounts of LNG over to handle their energy shortages. We'll see what happens next winter in the EU because they've already openly stated, some of the government ministers in various EU countries have stated they can't import LNG fast enough to replace all of what needs to be piped natural gas. It's just not going to happen. So the EU this year had a mild winter. They'll get through it okay. I'm just curious to see what's going to happen next winter. So electricity, increasing it can help, but it'll be in fits and starts and it's going to be very expensive. That's my view.
Agree it's expensive, but I will point out that one of the reasons long-term transmission lines have been stalled in terms of implementation, one of the big reasons is the interconnection queue. So I do view it as a bit of a bureaucratic problem, more so than an actual technical problem. I think in terms of cost, for sure there's cost, but if you look at, say, what we invest in just the war in Ukraine um, alone, and not to get into the politics, but certainly do have the sufficient resources within our government budget and within the private sector to support a
Nope.
lot more transition lines. But
Nope. There's a 2 year wait for transformers. 2 years.
I will say throughout supply chains globally, there is a challenge with all sorts of materials. I think that is a result of the COVID-19 pandemic for the most part, because we're seeing prices come way down. I'll give you an example. Ammonia prices were over 1,000. Ammonia is a good indicator because it you need it to eat, right? So it's a good indicator of inflation. And we've already seen a lot of these commodity prices drop dramatically. Natural gas prices were over 8. They're down below 3. Ammonia prices come way down, a number of commodity prices. So I think the COVID-19 disruption, in my view, was an anomaly. I think we're definitely not in the sort of disinflationary environment we had 10, 15 years ago, but I don't see rapid commodity price inflation. I think it'll be, regardless of what that is, um, I think supply chain around transformers and different, even concrete, ammonia, steel are starting to be alleviated a bit. And then you also are seeing China with this sort of what I would call depopulation story that's going to, I think, put downward pressure on commodity prices. So I guess my point is, if we could get the interconnection queues out of the way, I do believe we could build a lot more transmission lines.
A lot of government red tape is holding it up. It is not just for electrical transmission projects. It's for all energy projects. Government is so slow at approving permits. And what's happening is the wind and solar companies are finding out, hey, it takes a long time to get all of the necessary federal and state permits approved before we can even start doing this work. Hey, this isn't fair. Welcome to the party. It's been this way for oil and gas for a really long time. So the bureaucracy coming out of Washington, D.C., helping things. There's a lot of words that I tend to judge things more by their actions rather than people can say anything they want. And a lot of times
For sure.
saying the exact opposite of what's happening, the term is gaslighting. There's just a lot of bureaucratic red tape for oil and gas companies for pipelines. I call it death by 1,000 policy cuts. It's like Keystone pipeline. Look at that example. It's like there's not enough refineries. The number of oil refineries in the United States is declining. We've lost Oh, it's been a while since I looked at this. At least 200,000 barrels a day of oil refining capacity in the last couple of years. And it wasn't just from COVID, it was other places. It was uneconomical to run them. Think about this. Some people are saying, oh, look at all these huge profits. And it's no, a couple of years ago, think oil refineries were actually losing money. Nobody was spending blood and murder about that back then. So the US needs, and countries need, energy security. This is going to be increasingly important as rolling power blackouts become, unfortunately, more and more likely to happen in various places around the world. See what's going on in Pakistan. As I said, South Africa right now is on the verge of a war. California is having this largest economy in the world. And it's like they were warning about rolling power blackouts 6 months ago, if you recall. They need to improve their electrical grid infrastructure because one saving grace is California population is reducing. So that's reducing some of the pressure on the electrical demand. But that has nothing to do with the physics of moving electricity through transmission lines. It just means resource. California in particular is unusual circumstance because it's an energy island. They are deliberately cut off from most oil and gas and electricity from other states. There's very few direct resources that flow directly from other states into California. California imports the bulk of its oil from South America. It's just refusing to hook up natural gas lines. And now more and more cities and counties and areas are prohibiting natural hookups into new buildings. I think that's going to be a disaster waiting to happen because, again, you can store natural gas, can't really store electricity. And in a blackout, you can still use natural gas to cook. In a blackout, you can't if you have an electric stove.
No, I hear you. So I'll give the positive side of that coin. Down here in Florida, we have significantly reduced red tape throughout our government. So new construction, for example, we got hit with a hurricane. The governor rebuilt the bridge in 3 days. So if you have good government, you can reduce red tape. And the other thing I'll say about Florida is we have a very stable power grid. Of course, the basis of it is plenty of natural gas. So we've got lots of pipelines run down here. It's also a regulated utility. And so I am a free market economist, but when it comes to certain things like the power grid, I've seen in other countries where we sold projects all over the world. And I also see it here in Florida that a regulated power grid makes a lot of sense because there clearly is what they call in economics, a free rider problem associated with it. So when you see, if you remember electricity, all the grids used to be regulated and then they deregulated them. So you've got the ERCOT market in Texas and Cal ISO out in California. And those markets where they deregulated tend to have the most problems because of the fact that they have mispriced what I would call baseload, reliable, controllable.
Yes.
Right. For example, I think a megawatt hour from natural gas should probably be paid more than a megawatt hour from solar because it's reliable and controllable. You see markets like PJM in ERCOT, they do not give additional capacity payments for reliable, controllable power. But in markets like PJM, they do, which I think is smart. Now I think what we're also going to see is a lot of wind and solar farms are going to be making hydrogen and again, reliable, controllable, abundant power when their prices are zero or negative. So wind farms blow a lot at night. Sun pushes a lot in the midday when there isn't demand. That's a great time to be making hydrogen, which I think is a much better use and a much better energy storage media than batteries are because hydrogen does share the attributes of fossil fuel in that it provides unlimited duration energy storage. So that's the positive thing about hydrogen. Of course, the negative thing is you have to look at the full cycle of production and how much does that cost. And I'll say fossil fuels have benefited from hundreds of years of economic innovation, which is why their whole supply chain is so cheap. You can drill, you can bring it out, you can transport it for a very low cost. I actually think it's a modern marvel that we're able to get a gallon of gasoline at the pump for cheaper than, say, a gallon of water. It's absolutely a modern marvel. But when you look at something like hydrogen with technical innovation, at least we're going down the path of something that is reliable, controllable, and abundant. And I think once it's had say, several generations of economic innovation, I think that's a way we can get there because at least it shares many of the attributes of fossil fuels. So that's my view on it.
I'm I remain skeptical of hydrogen. I'm not strongly, it's not nearly as energy dense as, for example, natural gas. And my argument I usually bring up is why not just use natural gas instead? It's so much easier to transport. It's got so much more energy in it. Hydrogen leaks. It causes problems to metals, but
It's got many challenges, no doubt.
there are, but there's promise there. So that's the thing that I do like about it. If these engineering challenges can be addressed and overcome, humans are infinitely inventive, problem solving ways of doing it. If they can overcome the unique challenges of hydrogen, then I would support hydrogen, saying this might actually be the way forward. But until these challenges are actually suitably addressed, then just like saying massively increasing wind and solar is not going to work until you address the electrical grid infrastructure and massively build it out. You can't have both at the same time. You can't keep the existing electrical and double the amount of wind and solar electricity coming in. It's just not going to work.
I agree. I'm a big believer. You may have seen this online, but I'm a big believer in and, not or, right? So I think we need to do all these things. And what I like, another thing I like about hydrogen is if you have a wind or a solar farm that are existing, you can take some of that energy and put it into hydrogen as opposed to dumping it on the grid. And so it doesn't require additional energy infrastructure. Now you have to be able to transport it, which is a challenge. We are working with a company that has made significant advancements in liquefaction of hydrogen. It comes out of NASA, where they move around liquid hydrogen all the time. What's nice about hydrogen, especially liquid hydrogen, is it's very energy dense and it's much lighter than gaseous hydrogen. So you can, for example, fly a drone for 24 hours on liquid hydrogen compared to gaseous, which weighs down the drone and then it doesn't work very well. I'm not saying that all these things don't require technical advancements, but at least those technical advancements to me seem feasible and are moving towards a solution that is abundant, controllable, and I'm forgetting the third one, but a natural and storable. So that's where, and that's also why I like RNG a lot because RNG is nice in that it's taking an existing problem, let's say a waste stream, and converting that into something that's usable and storable. So that's the way I approach it. And I do think that it's going to take longer than we think to get there, but I think it's worth going after the energy transition.
You've actually managed to change my mind a little bit about the hydrogen because I poked around on this a little bit. I am by no means an expert in hydrogen. I've looked at it. I get very scared when people say, oh, we can just add hydrogen to the natural gas pipelines. It's, no, the molecules are too small and there's hydrogen embrittlement on the pipelines. It's just, no, these pipelines were not designed to handle hydrogen. So if you can liquefy hydrogen using wind and solar and using that rather than putting the wind and solar electricity on the grid, I think that'll solve some of the intermittent electricity problems on the grid and use it in fits and starts to manufacture hydrogen. That seems to be a more workable long-term promise than just keep adding more higher amounts of intermittent electricity onto the already existing strained grid. See, when you're manufacturing hydrogen, I don't believe you're going to necessarily need a steady stream of electricity like you do on the grid. Not technical, but it just seems to me if you can do that to manufacture hydrogen and come up with ways around the tiny molecule size of hydrogen, hydrogen embrittlement in metal, liquid hydrogen is storable, is transportable, it's an energy source, it's clean burning. Okay. So just someone would need to convince me that the technical feasibility of addressing and handling all of these problems. In the meantime, stick with oil and gas, but I'm not going to say thing and rather than or like that.
Absolutely. And hydrogen does have one attribute that oil and gas don't have, and that is that you can effectively make it anywhere. So if you have wind and you can make it on a small scale. So I look at it as a distributed version of oil and gas in that you don't need massive drilling, extraction, pipeline, and all that sort of stuff in order to make it useful. Now, I don't think it's going to be replacing oil and gas anytime soon, but at least shares similar attributes. And it also has one attribute that makes it attractive that oil and gas don't have. So let's say you have a remote mining operation and you want to power your mining trucks with hydrogen. You can set up wind and solar, you can use it to make hydrogen, you can power your mining trucks, and it can be more cost effective because of how much it costs to move oil and gas to this remote site. So for your mainstream pull up to the pump type stuff, it's going to be really hard for it to get as cost effective as oil and gas without a carbon tax. But I do actually see that most likely coming, regardless of the politics of it. I do see a carbon tax coming, and it could potentially, I think hydrogen for that reason could be an effective replacement, but it's certainly not going to happen in the next 20 years. I think this is a 30-year or greater sort of a move, but it could be cool. We might end up like the Jetsons. We can just make power wherever we need it.
I was going to say it would take a long time to set up the necessary refilling infrastructure for gen. That was not going to happen in the space of years. You're talking multiple decades. So again, I'm not going to say no. I like your idea of oil promise. I remain skeptical. It's just oil and gas is proven. And my refrain for a long time has been, unless you can find something that is as suitable as hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, then modern society is going to continue to need fossil fuels for the next few decades. I don't see any way around this.
I'll give you one more use case on hydrogen. Liquid hydrogen actually make a heavy duty truck go farther than diesel fuel because of how energy dense it is. You can go it has 1,000 mile range, and the refueling time on a liquid hydrogen is the same as diesel. So you've got something that has a greater range. Um, the trucks, hydrogen fuel cell trucks actually perform better than diesel trucks, believe it or not, in terms of the torque, the power, the ability to climb a hill. They're really breathtakingly great. They can go 1,000 miles and you can refuel them quickly. So it has all that. Now, dollars to dollars cost, it's not at cost parity yet, but it's getting very close. And with the $3 hydrogen production tax credit, it's really close. I see it as being within the next 10 years, I think we're going to see heavy duty hydrogen fuel cell trucks in a lot of places.
I can't realistically about this because this is not one of my areas of expertise. I have a general knowledge of it, but you know much more about this than I do, and I don't want to stick my foot in my mouth. So,
Oh, I gotcha. So I'm just throwing out there that there are some what I would call green shoots, if you want to use that word, of opportunity, both when it comes to RNG and when it comes to hydrogen. It's exciting times to be in the industry. There's no doubt about that, given how long the industry has stayed relatively stable for so many years. I think it's exciting to be around in this time of innovation, which I view as being like the computer revolution. If you could have been right in the midst of that in the 80s and 90s, including semiconductors, that was a very exciting time. And I think we're going to see that in the energy industry.
okay, I'm not going to argue with you on that point. There's a lot of stuff going on, but remain fairly steadfast until I see otherwise. The world is going to need increasing amounts of hydrocarbons over the next couple of decades. I just can't see any way around this.
No doubt. And the part we didn't cover was the 3 billion people that are in energy poverty. So if
Yep.
you're somebody who cares about people, and I think I would say from a philosophical standpoint, I would consider myself very pro human and very in favor of human beings continuing to flourish and grow. If you feel that way, you have to care about the 3 billion people that are in energy poverty. And for them, the only way to really get them out of that, I think, is going to be with increasing amounts of fossil fuel.
Correct.
Now, I think on us in the US and Europe, it's our job to come up with the innovations that are going to allow ourselves to transition off of complete reliance, let's say, on fossil fuel. But it's, I think, wrong-headed to begrudge the 3 billion people that don't even live in a modern society with longevity, with all the things that we enjoy. It's not right to begrudge them coming into the modern world.
I've been to rural villages in countries around the world visiting, and there's people that still cook with this is a reality in the modern world. So they don't care about pollution. They don't care about tax credits. They'll be happy to get oil and gas or coal to help them cook rather than cooking with cow manure.
Which is also a reduction
Yes.
compared with using wood or dung. super common in the third world, and it's also terrible for indoor air quality and all the pollution stuff that we addressed in the 70s. So I really do see huge value in the environmental movement that has improved our air quality in this country. And I think we should recognize that. But this topic is something that really requires a balanced approach. And unfortunately, we're so polarized right now. It's very difficult to get to that, let's call it golden center. I think maybe 30 years ago it was a lot easier, but in today's world, we're very polarized, unfortunately. And we could talk about why, but we certainly are.
I'm looking for pragmatic solutions. So the key thing is if it's workable. There's a lot of pie in the sky solutions, which are just not going to happen. And I just snicker about it. So we need reliable power. We need reliable energy. And this becomes abundantly obvious when you got unexpected power blackouts and everything. That's when people wake up and it's, guess what? We actually do need reliable power. We do need reliable energy.
Absolutely. And we need more of it, right? So
Yes.
that I think what becomes a challenge is when people think we're going to reduce energy consumption. We've really wrung most of the value out of energy efficiency, not to say that there isn't more to be wrung out. But when it comes to over the energy transition over the next 20 years, the world needs more energy, not less. And we've got to figure out a way to get there with abundant, controllable, naturally storable energy. That ends up being, hopefully, we take an approach that's pro-human. So that's my view on it.
I would agree. I have no argument or disagreement with that general premise. We're on the same page here.
So it's pretty good, Tom. We found some common ground here today. We're basically at time, but it was a pleasure having you on. I think you bring a very unique perspective, a lot of experience in oil and gas. And I would say all of us that are sitting here now trying to take things through some sort of energy transition need to, I think, a degree of respect and gratitude for the innovation that's happened in the oil and gas sector since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. We have to acknowledge that we're sitting here in the cradle of comfort that's as a result of that, because the world was really not a very hospitable place to human beings before the Industrial Revolution. I watch a lot of history, chronicles the Middle Ages, and it wasn't very comfortable to be alive back then. Life expectancy was maybe half of what it is now. And people spent most of their time just trying to meet their basic necessities. So even the ability to sit here with leisure time and do a podcast, we owe, I think, to the Industrial Revolution and to the oil and gas industry.
Agreed. Once you don't have power freely available on demand, everything changes. Everything stops. So you start worrying in modern life. Power goes out. Oh no. What about the meat in my freezer? You're a vegetarian, it doesn't really count, but things just don't work. Your phone doesn't work. Your computer won't work. The internet won't work. All sorts of things won't work. Everything, you can't go to the office. You can't, just shuts down. So the civilized world depends on reliable energy. So any transition away from oil and gas has to be an alternative source of reliable, storable, movable energy. We're on the same page about this. So we're running out of run a little bit. I apologize for that.
Now,
Talking with you.
Tom, it's been great. This has been Tom Kirkman, and he's been in international oil and gas for 20 years. He's been all over the world with the industry. Our oil is a bit of a miracle that we can even execute on that, and he has experience there. So I think what's cool is today we were able to find a lot of common ground, and hopefully that's a place where we can all get together and try to move forward. So, Tom, it's been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you again. It was great talking to you.
Good stuff. Bye bye.
All right. Bye bye.